Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence-based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This is your host, Phil Ord. Warning, this podcast may challenge your views on environmentalism and push back on conventional environmental thought with science and data. We hope you approach with humanism and an open mind. This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, ANE, a pro-nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem, global climate change. Our mission statement is as follows. Nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever-growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment. We are very excited to talk to two very special guests for this podcast, Dr. Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen, 2020 Libertarian Party nominees for President and Vice President of the United States. The Libertarian Party is America's third largest political party, so this is quite a big deal for us. It is especially a big deal because a big talking point of this party in this election cycle is the outward support of nuclear power as a way to address the climate issue. Joe Jorgensen has especially been vocal about the use of this technology, especially to reach out to potential voters concerned about the environment. Spike Cohen has expressed support of the technology as well. Here is some background on Dr. Jorgensen. Joe is a senior lecturer in psychology at Clemson University. She holds a PhD in industrial/organizational psychology and has taught full-time since 2006. She graduated in 1979 from Baylor University with a BS in psychology, and in 1980 graduated from Southern Methodist University with an MBA. Joe started her own software sales business in 1983 and founded a business consulting company in 2002 and continues working with select clients. In 1992, she was the Libertarian Party's candidate for South Carolina's 4th Congressional District. A few years later, in 1996, Jorgensen won the Libertarian Party vice presidential nominee with Harry Brown. And now, in 2020, she recently made history by becoming the first female presidential nominee in Libertarian Party history. And now to Spike Cohen. Spike Cohen is the Libertarian Party nominee for vice president, running alongside Dr. Jorgensen. Spike started a web design company in his teens in 1999 and grew it into a successful business. In 2016, he was diagnosed with MS. Faced with that life-changing discovery, Spike decided to retire from web design and focus his life on his true passion, spreading the message of liberty to the public. This culminated in his becoming the host of My Fellow Americans and the co-host of the Muddied Waters of Freedom, and the co-owner of Muddied Waters Media. Last month, the Libertarian Party nominated him to be their vice presidential candidate, making him the first millennial on a presidential ticket in American history. Spike's leadership and communication skills that he learned from 20 years of starting, growing, and operating a business are serving him well in his run for the White House. So that's a little bit about our guests today. I am super excited for this episode, and without any further ado, here is my conversation with Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen. Enjoy. Dr. Joe Jorgensen, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to talk to you, and it's honestly an exciting time being a libertarian, hearing all the talk about nuclear power. So I
Yes.
guess I guess we will get straight into it.
Well, in fact, before you start asking me questions, if you don't mind,
Okay.
I'd like to mention that I've got 3 top issues, And one of the issues, one of the top three, is the environment. And my main issue for that is that we need to go nuclear. So this isn't just like I happened upon your show. I've been promoting this for over a year.
Great. That's good to hear, and I think the pro-nuclear environmental movement is starting to really gain some traction. So
Yep.
this helps out a lot. So all right. Well, let me ask you our first questions. What made you cite the environment as a critical issue to gather support for the Libertarian Party, and what led you to see nuclear power as a good solution to climate change?
Yeah, so in general, I chose the environment because the young people are very interested in it and they're concerned about it. And libertarians in the past have often talked about what interests them and not what interests voters. And voters are demanding a better option for energy, especially the younger voters. And so we need to meet that need. And the reason I chose nuclear is because it's basically, if you love the environment, the only true choice is nuclear power.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just in terms of the very physics of it. It's a very dense fuel. It's zero emissions, and it can be rapidly scaled, uh, even within a capitalist framework, in my opinion. So, uh, yeah, that's great to hear. So many pro-nuclear advocates think that the government has gotten in the way of nuclear power innovation.
Mhm.
What would you push in Washington to fix the regulatory red tape of this planet saving industry?
So, as I'm sure you know, we haven't had a nuclear power plant in this country in 30 years. And as I mentioned before, this is clean technology. If you love the environment, you need to be for nuclear power. So we are missing all of the benefit of this modern technology with emissions-free energy that the nuclear power can produce. So we absolutely have to streamline and reduce the regulations that are issued by the NRC that are making building a nuclear power plant cumbersome. As president, I will appoint a chairman to head the NRC who is on board with an agenda to deregulate and streamline the organization. And as with everything, one thing that the libertarians are always emphasizing is that often government gets in the way of individuals doing the right thing, doing the best thing. And so just like with everything else, healthcare, Social Security, when we get government out of the way of nuclear power, we can quickly move towards more plants and show that they can compete successfully.
For sure, and yeah, I think one of the problems is that these large plants uh, have have just taken so long to build, and they go over budget. And you look at places like China and South Korea and the United Arab Emirates; they can build these things in 5 years, relatively on time and on budget. And
Right. And yeah, and I'm sure I'm sure you know more about this than I do, although I have done a lot of reading into this. But my understanding is that basically what happened was the government came up with their one monopoly solution, one type of nuclear power plant that they ordained. And then, of course, just like everything else in the free market, they stopped working to come up with the best quality. And my understanding is now with the new advanced nuclear power, we've got a lot of smaller plants and we've got different companies coming up with different plants so they can compete with each other.
yeah, it's a way to circumvent some of the problems with these more larger designs. And I'd just say, to be fair, the government tries to choose one or two designs, because
Mhm.
if you pick too many, then it's hard to duplicate it over and over and over again.
Mhm.
But countries that have used the state to institute nuclear power have chosen like one or two designs to build over and over again. But our goal is to try to get the right energy built without the government having to fund it.
Oh, absolutely. And I would like to see additional competition. In fact, I've likened it to if we've got, let's say we've got Steve Jobs with Apple, we've got Bill Gates, we've got IBM, we've got all these different computer companies competing for your business. What if the government had come out and said, okay, we pick Bill Gates, everybody else just stop building computers? And my understanding is that Rolls-Royce is one of the companies, and we've got several other companies that are building technology so that, just like how Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had to work hard again, competing against each other, coming up with the best product, that's what we're seeing now with nuclear energy, that people are trying to come up with a better product that is not the old-fashioned nuclear power that people think about.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there's all sorts of like startups, and one thing I think the government's done well. It's actually surprisingly sorry, excuse me, sorry. Uh, there's actually quite a bit of bipartisan support for advancing nuclear in Congress. But one thing this government has been changing is they're going to help these startups test their designs on national lab property. So basically, giving them a place to test their designs so that they can get them out to market and compete. So
Yes, exactly. So
yeah,
um, I think that we're headed in the right direction.
definitely. Cool. Well, I have a few more questions here. Let me ask you.
Sure.
Um, do you think the government hoists up the fossil fuel industry unfairly? And would you commit to ending all energy subsidies, including nuclear, and especially subsidies given to the fossil fuel companies that are the ones that are polluting?
Oh, yeah. Well, there were a couple of questions in there,
Yeah, sorry
but
about that.
yeah. Do I think that the government hoists, I believe you said, up the fossil fuel industry unfairly? Absolutely. And I would end all energy subsidies, all
Hmm.
wind, solar, nuclear,
Yep.
coal, everything, because if an energy source isn't good enough uh, to that somebody would invest their own money. Why should you take somebody else's money and invest it? If there were profits to be made, if it was a good enough power source, and I'm talking any power source, if
Yeah.
any power source was good enough to make a profit on, then we would have people trying to do that so they could make a profit. And the fact that wind and solar need so much government subsidies, so many government subsidies, just shows that that's not a good option, because people aren't willing to subsidize it themselves with their own money. So
And people will argue that, oh, wind and solar aren't really that subsidized. But if you look at per unit energy derived from those sources, they are subsidized the most. And I don't want to say no renewables like wind and solar. All I want to do is have all these sources compete on merit. And I honestly believe nuclear will compete the best on merit. But I'm saying let's not decide the winners or losers. Let's have a competition.
yeah, exactly. And that's what the Libertarian Party believes in everything. And do you mind if I give a healthcare example for nuclear here?
Sure. Yep, that's
Bring
fine.
something? Because what we need, the beauty of the free market is that people work for you, that companies try to give you the best quality for the lowest price. Otherwise, they go out of business. And if you look in the healthcare industry, which we've all heard, and well, we all know, we're feeling it, prices keep going up and up and up. There are two fields in which prices have been going down. And those two fields are cosmetic surgery and LASIK surgery. And it's because insurance doesn't pay for those. People pay for them out of their own pocket. So what's happening is the doctors in those fields have to work to show that they have the best product. They have to earn your business. They have to lower the price or whatever to get you to go over to them. And that's the kind of market competition I would like to see in energy. We need to
Hmm.
have a level playing field and let all forms of energy compete. And I know that if that happens, nuclear energy is going to do much better than many of the other ones. So again, if it doesn't make sense to spend your own money on it, why would it make sense to take other people's money and spend it on it? If it were such a good investment, people would be spending their own money on it.
Right, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. So, um, let me ask you a few more questions here. What do you bring to the climate issue that speaks to both the right and the left?
Well, I would say if you don't like crony capitalism, and if you want to get the government out of the way of emission-free energy, then we need to end subsidies and deregulation. That both the left and the right would like to see their hard-earned dollars, would like to keep as many of their hard-earned dollars as they can. And if you think about it, um, who doesn't want cheaper energy? Look at how expensive uh, our heating bills can be, air conditioning bills. So everybody gets to save money. With that money, they can go out to dinner, they can, work towards a vacation, whatever. So if you want to put an end to threats to the economy like the Green New Deal, my plan does that. It allows people to keep their own power, to keep their own choice.
Interesting. Yeah, what I've noticed in my years working at this now is you meet some very interesting, like, uh, or you come toward you see some interesting coalitions being formed. Nuclear power is one of those technologies that offers you know the lifeblood of the economy many of the conservatives want, and offers the carbon-free electricity most of uh, most of the left wants. So I found weird support. Like nuclear power is one of the things that I believe can get people that are skeptical on climate and those who are concerned about climate on the same page. So
Yeah,
it's interesting.
that's an excellent point. And we really all want the same thing. We all want to have nice homes that our families can go to. We want a job that we enjoy. We want and it's just a matter of how we get there. That gives us a difference in opinion. But yeah, you make a good point.
Yeah, it's like Gary Johnson said, um, most people are libertarian; they just don't know it yet.
Exactly.
So yeah, let's see. I don't have that many more questions left. You said you had about 20 minutes.
Yes, I can just yeah, I can just mention a few other things, which
Okay.
is that
Yep. Go ahead.
if I keep talking about it in terms of the environment, and I don't think we've really emphasized the economy as much. So,
Right.
not, exactly. So, modern nuclear power plants serve all of our concerns, not just having a clean environment, but also having a clean environment without sacrificing the economy. And that's really important. As you know, people who identify as conservatives are concerned about legislation like the Green New Deal and what it can do to the economy. So, and they don't like the idea of the huge carbon tax. So,
Right. I was gonna, and I don't know, because I don't know what you are comfortable answering, but I actually have a hypothetical for you, a question
okay.
that it refers to this thing, and I know it sounds like government, big government, but it's called the carbon fee and dividend.
Hmm.
And that it's actually, so there's this group called the Citizens Climate Lobby that
Hmm.
is bipartisan, and it gathers support from Republicans and Democrats on climate, which is rare. But the idea is to do this thing called a fee and dividend, as in, first of all, it's not a tax, and that the government does not keep any of the revenue, and all of the revenue gets given back to every single citizen, which would help the poor people with the temporary increase of costs in finding new sources of energy.
Hmm.
And what it would do is uh, it would be like a fee at the point of extraction, like per ton of coal, per barrel of oil, and per liter of natural gas, uh, because that has a climate cost, and uh, it would be ratcheted up slowly. And the way I would look at it
Hmm.
if you're following, is um, is I don't think anybody should be able to pollute for free, and I do think the fossil fuel industry has been able to, maybe will disagree with me, but treat the uh, the atmosphere as a dumping ground for all sorts of, you know, pollutants like greenhouse
Right.
gases and then NOx and SOx and all sorts of particulate matter. I was wondering, do you think anything like that could ever be in a libertarian ideal?
Well, the libertarian ideal is that people can peacefully choose what to spend their money on, how to, where to work, and so forth. That they get to make their own choices in their own lives. So I heard you say that this wasn't through the government, correct?
The government does not get to keep any of the revenue. It gets funneled back to every citizen,
Oh,
kind of like the. Oh yeah,
but
go ahead.
okay, but the government is still in charge of it, right?
Yes, but it would be a lot less bureaucratic because it's
Yeah.
just collecting revenue and cutting checks. That's kind of this is the more kind of like progressive leaning libertarian ideas because I'm not a very uh uh you know radical libertarian. I'm more of a moderate. So
Yes. Well, my stance is pretty much anything the government can do, people can do on their own much better. That once you involve the government, then you're starting to lose control and power. So I would
mhm,
have to look at that.
okay,
The way you've described it, I don't understand, why it couldn't be done without the government, as most things could be done.
right.
So, if as long as people are voluntarily exchanging amongst each other, as long as
Right.
they're voluntarily paying for something they want, it's fine with me. So, but I would have to look at that a little, more thoroughly. But like I said, I can't think of hardly anything that the government does better than a group of individuals couldn't do.
All right, sounds good to me. And the argument could be made that as long as the regulations are fair and the government isn't picking winners and losers, the best technology will win on merit, and we might not even need to look at carbon pricing at all. So I think that
Yeah,
that's yeah,
and that's the whole point of getting the government out of it, exactly. And so, uh, and and I would like to mention, you said you're a more moderate libertarian. I wouldn't call myself a moderate libertarian. I want to
that's okay.
go. I want to go all the way. All I want are police, courts, and military. However, I
Fair
don't
enough.
mind. Yeah. However, I don't mind taking baby steps along the way. So,
Right.
because, for instance, with Social Security, what I've said is I want an immediate opt out for the younger people because they know it's a broken system. I don't want them to pay into it. But for the old people, I say old people, but people who have retired, I'm not going to just pull the rug out from underneath them.
Hmm.
I would say you've paid into the system for 50 or 60 years. We're going to sell government assets and give you that money, give you your money back. So I'm not about, let's just pull the rug out from everybody. I'm fine with taking steps along the way.
Exactly. And I actually, at a rally in 2016, I was able to talk to Gary Johnson, and he said,
Mhm.
he'd be willing to consider pollution controls that are enforced in a court of law because I just believe, just my personal opinion is that, you could pollute on your own property, but,
Oh,
once it flows over to other people, then you become culpable with the non-aggression principle and whatnot.
yeah, of course.
Yep.
And as I'm sure you know, libertarians view pollution as trespassing. And we do
Yep.
have laws against trespassing, and
Yep.
we've got police and courts that enforce that.
Right.
So, of course, we would like to enforce pollution trespassing. And that's the problem, again, with the government in charge is our beautiful waterways, the Gulf of Mexico spill, all of a lot of these things could be prevented or at least have a cleaner environment if it were owned privately, where people had a vested interest and they could sue people for polluting, which is basically trespassing.
Right, got it. Okay, well, we're kind of running low on time here, but
Yep,
I wanted to say thanks for joining us. Do you want to tell our listeners where to go to learn more about you and your candidacy?
absolutely. It's joj2020.com. So it's joj2020.com. And we'd love to have you check us out. If you
Great.
are interested in nuclear energy, if you are pro nuclear energy, the Libertarian Party is the only party that is advocating it like this. So please come to our site.
Well said. Thank you so much for coming on to our show. I can't tell you how honored I am to have a presidential candidate on my
Oh,
little baby podcast. So
oh, thank you.
appreciate it.
This is an important issue. I was just so thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And here we have Spike Cohen, Libertarian Party vice presidential nominee. How are you, Spike?
I'm doing great, Phil. How are you doing?
I'm ecstatic that I am actually interviewing people that are running for president and vice president. That's crazy. I'm kind of fangirling a little bit right now. So I've pretty new to the Libertarian Party, but we try to keep things non-partisan here. So we want to try to reach across to Democrats and Republicans too for the magic of nuclear power.
Right,
So,
absolutely.
So let's see. I'm trying to think where we should start. So the way I like to frame climate change and pollution and what to do about it is in terms of private property rights. And that's kind of a different lens to look at. But I see there is a glitch in the energy system where what we use to produce the energy releases a greenhouse gas that we don't know when and how, but we have a general idea can really disrupt the climate system, which I think is a threat to liberty and prosperity elsewhere. So I look at carbon pollution as like a tragedy of the commons issue where it is an externality that affects everyone. So when you release carbon dioxide, it does not just pollute your own private property, it pollutes the entire world and mixes with the atmosphere.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
based on that, do you think the government has a responsibility to step in and somehow penalize carbon dioxide emissions?
I think that the government has put us in the position that we're in right now. If you look at where we are right now, first of all, the largest single polluter is the U.S. government. If you look at the actions of the government and the military, it is easily the single largest polluting organization on Earth. And then if you look at all of the other large polluters, they're all the cronies that have created their massive dominance in their various sectors of the market, not necessarily by increasing demand or having a large amount of value in the market, but by leveraging the fiat and of the law and leveraging the politicians that they put in place to entrench themselves and to retain their positions and grow their positions of power and wealth and influence in the market without having to actually create enough value to have gotten there in the first place. And so because of that, I tend to be somewhat skeptical of the idea of government being the source of solutions here. Now, I will say, with that said, like you were saying, this is a property rights issue. And there's actually been a lot of debate in libertarian circles about the property rights issue when applied to something like pollution, whether it's climate change, whether it's carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, or even just regular pollution like, air pollution, water pollution, and so forth. Energy is a perfect example of something that in and of itself is not creating any direct aggression. But if you look at the carbon dioxide output with some sources of energy, the toxic waste that is created, the water pollution that is created, those are they are externalizing their costs and their waste on everyone else, which in a strict property rights sense is an act of aggression, or at least something that needs to be restored or be that there needs to be a rectification of that. And I'm not sure that's going to come from government. I think that the best thing government can do right now is to stop subsidizing dirty forms of energy, and also stop subsidizing the so-called renewables that just, at least for now, aren't there yet. And in some cases, I recently read a study about how in Europe, as they were trying to bring all of the nuclear power plants offline and replace them with so-called renewables, because the renewables are not as reliable in providing steady energy to the grid, it was causing them to have to use more greenhouse gas during those surge times and during the times when, for example, there wasn't as much wind or there wasn't as much sunlight. And so you actually saw a net increase in greenhouse gas consumption because of a switching from the nuclear model, which is entirely stable and is producing the same stable amount of energy in any kind of environmental conditions, replacing it with so-called renewables that were much more unstable and much less predictable in terms of when they could reach their peak output. So there was another perfect example of, by government injecting themselves into the market instead of allowing the market to do what it does, we ended up with more greenhouse gas production as a direct result of not allowing the market to meet its needs.
Yeah, definitely. When you're referring to Germany, and they're starting to close their nuclear power plants, and because of that, they're still heavily reliant on lignite coal, which is the dirtiest coal of them
Right.
all. And France, on the other hand, is 70% nuclear powered electric grid, and 20, I think, and then 20% hydro. So they're basically one of the cleanest grids in Europe, and no one is paying attention to that.
Right.
But the reason why I brought up the talking about this in terms of property rights is there is a policy position, and I know anytime the government does something, it rubs libertarians the wrong way for good reason, which is fine. Um, but there's this bipartisan rule called the carbon fee and dividend. Now, it's not a tax; it's called a carbon fee and dividend, and it basically, what it would do is, because greenhouse gas emissions are, I think, a violation of the non-aggression principle, and there should be a way to gently start to put a price on it. Meaning, at the point of extraction, you would put a few cents per ton of coal, per liter of natural gas, and per barrel of oil. That would all go into one pot, then that pot would go back to every single American citizen. So it's basically the fossil fuel industry, in a sense, paying reparations. I don't like that word, but
Right.
paying some sort of fee to the
Paying a
carbon pollution.
restitution for what they did. Right.
And then
Right.
if you deregulate all the energy, including nuclear, I mean, I want nuclear to play fair, that way, it would incentivize people to do whatever they can to move off of fossil fuels as cost effectively as possible. And if nuclear is like, the regulations are streamlined, it could be a big player in that. I was just wondering what you would think of that. And I know you're more on the kind of, uh, not conservative end, but like the more strict end of libertarianism. But just thought what would you think about something like that?
So my concern is, it's one of these things that sounds good as an idea. This is an act of aggression, and in order to level off and allow for restitution of that aggression, the government gets in and basically, like you said, sets a price for carbon output. Everyone pays into it, and then it's given out to everyone. The problem is what we've seen whenever the government does something like this, with whatever the best of intentions may have been, over time we get the mission creep that is standard issue with government regulations. The
Mm,
cronies step in to get their exemptions. Other cronies
yes.
step in to make sure that certain types of in this case, greenhouse gases are seen as, it's sort of in the animal farm. Some animals are more equal than others, and some types of carbon will be seen as more equal than others. And what ends up happening is you end up with essentially a slush fund that will almost assuredly end up being used for cronies and their intent purposes. A perfect example is all of the the renewable, all of the the investments from government that have gone towards renewable energy were with the best of intention. It was the idea that there would be this sort of Manhattan project, if you will, of the federal government jump-starting renewable energy so that we could finally move into the 21st century and move away from polluting greenhouse gases, which again don't just cause climate change, but they cause all sorts of terrible things. That spewing that kind of stuff into the air causes all sorts of trouble. Not besides just greenhouse climate change. But what do we have now? What we have now is the government arbitrarily and centrally planning out our energy grid and our energy future. And as a result, the cronies are deciding what happens there. So now what's happening is, instead of the market making decisions in terms of what is the best way to move forward on energy. Okay, cool. So yeah, as I was saying, we ended up in a situation where government was subsidizing corn farms in Iowa for ethanol, even though it had been proven that that didn't really help with greenhouse gas emissions. If anything, there's some that said that it was actually worse. But
Yep.
because government created a so-called solution, and the cronies stepped in for what they needed, and in that case, the politicians wanted to help Iowa because that was the first state that has their caucus or primary that chooses the presidential nominees. They got top billing. So I tend to think that rather than putting the decisions in the hands of those who are largely doing it for political and personal finance considerations, I think in this case, this is another example where it would be best left to the market. And in this case, that would mean removing the subsidies that are tipping the scales away from, for example, nuclear. And also in terms of potentially removing I understand that there are some protections against lawsuits that some energy companies have where they can't be sued for the damage that they are doing that is environmental damage. That would be another perfect example of removing the government and allowing the market to work. So I would definitely support that.
Yeah, sometimes with the whole energy and climate thing, I am more and more convinced that a lot of the environmental movement's misled, governments are incompetent,
Yep.
and the only way out is technology. And whatever that technology is, it has to be affordable. Because if energy is not cheap, no one's going to buy it. Because
Exactly.
it's the lifeblood of all economies all over the world. I don't care if you're, communist or, anarchist libertarian. You need cheap energy for it all to work. And that's why I think nuclear represents our way out. And because if we I think if we had a more even playing field for energy, it would win, and it would put fossil fuels out of business. But right now we have kind of a protection for fossil fuels, which I don't think that's moral either. So yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. I just like to, always keep in mind some sort of policy that might work to nudge us in the right direction. But I totally get what you're saying. And
here's another way that government could be helpful. Part of the reason that we are in all of the wars that we are in is to secure cheap fossil fuels. Now, you want to talk about an externalization. How about bombing and invading and destabilizing entire regions of the world at the cost of trillions of dollars a year and countless lives lost both in those countries and among our friends and neighbors and loved ones who go over there and fight. There's a real externalization there that's happening to the benefit of the fossil fuel cronies. If that wasn't happening, fossil fuels would be necessarily more expensive and slightly harder to get. And that would be another perfect example of how, if that weren't happening, then nuclear would make all that much more sense. We don't have to, bomb foreign countries for nuclear energy. And so that's just another example of how the government getting out of the market, the government getting out of the situation and simply allowing market decisions to be made by individuals and organizations working voluntarily with one another to find the best solutions to the challenges that we face, rather than having those decisions made by politicians and their cronies and bureaucrats. We'll be in a much better position.
It's also geopolitically the fact that we have to rely on finding these vast quantities of fuel to power everything.
Yep.
And fighting over it is also a problem. The thing about nuclear power is, yes, it uses a fuel, but the fuel is so plentiful and so dense, it's basically no fuel at all. And that sounds like the economics of nuclear fuel is weird that way, where it really doesn't cost much. It only costs to refine it, to put it into the reactor. But the fuel is there's so much fuel in the world, and we can recycle it and all that. And it's basically I like to tell people nuclear power is like a magic electricity box. You just set it up, plug it in, and it can give you uninterrupted power for like decades. So, and it would just help, I think, a lot with our national security, not, to be in bed with the Saudis and stuff like that, where it makes the world more volatile if we have to keep relying on fossil fuels for electricity.
Absolutely. Cheap, stable, clean energy. If you look at any of the major economic advancements that have happened since the industrial age, every single one of them corresponds with a to whatever degree they were the people in the market were able to dramatically reduce the cost and increase the supply of energy, you saw a corresponding revolution in some cases of the economy, both worldwide and in specific regions. And so the cheaper and more plentiful well, really just the cheaper and more plentiful energy is, the better it is for all of us. And of course, the cleaner it is, the better it is for all of us. So if you can have a situation where not only does it become cheaper and more plentiful, but also cleaner, then that's better across the board. And that will lead to dramatic societal changes. When things are cheaper, when energy is cheaper, societies can change more easily. And we can have technological advancements more easily that benefit us in every way, in ways large and small, in every way that we can possibly think of.
Definitely. And I sometimes define, like, when I talk about nuclear power, I mean, just because I'm in love with that technology, but I consider it basically energy liberation forever. And that means so much to humanity. And at the beginning of the nuclear power age, that's what a lot of these technologists were thinking. They're just like, man, we can have power for all the poor people without polluting. And then it got turned sour through, you know, misguided environmentalists and probably even some sabotage by competing industries to get, you know, knocked off the path. And now I think people are waking up to being like, oh crap, we made a big mistake. So I was just wondering, why do you think nuclear power is, especially this election cycle, so popular with the Libertarian presidential candidates before you guys were nominees?
Well, I think that we recognize, we have a situation where between the Republicans and Democrats, when they look at energy and climate change, they fall into two kind of nonsensical camps. One camp on the Republican side is still insisting that climate change isn't real, that it's a hoax from China, that the scientists are making it up. They point to the fact that, and this is true, that that the climate does naturally change even without human input. But what they're not realizing is that gradual increase that's happening because of human input. It's sort of someone explained it. It's sort of like a bathtub. That if a bathtub, the amount of water in it was naturally going up and down, and we as humans, turned on the faucet and just let it trickle, even though it wouldn't be noticeable immediately, over time that trickling would cause it to go up more dramatically to a point that isn't within the natural scope of climate change. On the other side are Democrats who recognize climate change is real, although sometimes they may catastrophize it immediately. Al Gore saying that the seas would rise by 2007, and where I live in Myrtle Beach would be completely underwater. 13 years ago. But then you also have that they're using it not necessarily to push good ideas, certainly not market-based ideas, but they're using it to push more of the same, more cronyism. The so-called Green New Deal is nothing if not more cronyism for their favored crony businesses, more investments in companies like the next Solyndra, which will run up billions of dollars in federal grants and loans and go bankrupt because the underlying technology behind it was always suspect. And there will be many more like that. The idea that the biggest problems here are that individual Americans are driving around in cars as opposed to the massive crony polluters, and the U.S. government themselves that does the vast majority of the polluting. So using the reality of climate change not as a reason to make revolutionary changes in the market and in the way that we get energy, but more so to try to use it to force their pet social changes and pet projects that often don't have much, if at all, to do with the issue of energy or the climate or the environment. So given those two options, there's really only one party that's going to provide a sensible option between them, and that's the Libertarian Party. We do, or most of us, recognize that climate change is real, or that at the very least, there is sufficient evidence to believe that this could potentially be a problem if we don't even just agree with it outright. And if that is the case, as libertarians, we recognize that the market is always the best way to find solutions to the problems that we face. And in contrast, the government is often the one creating these problems, making them worse, or at the very least, making it harder for us to find those solutions. And so I think that naturally brings us to nuclear energy, which has proven itself to be the overall safest. And I think, for people who know about Fukushima and, Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, they may, grimace when they hear me say safer. But if you look, even with those factored in, if you look at the relative safety profile of nuclear energy and compare it to anything else that is producing anywhere near the same amount of energy as nuclear, it's not even comparable. Nuclear is far, far safer, even with those accidents, which have already in newer power plants, they've already addressed those safety concerns so that they won't happen in the future. Whereas with these older and dirtier forms of energy, they don't have anything in place to make it safer over time. It's going to remain as unsafe as it always has been. I am truly someone who believes that any conversation about reducing greenhouse gases that is not centered around reducing greenhouse gas through the implementation and expansion of nuclear energy is not a serious discussion about greenhouse gases, because it's not looking at the data. It's not looking at the way that we can both maintain or even increase the amount of energy accessibility we have and reduce the cost, and also reduce the actual problem, which is the greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's where we are.
Yeah, you hit so many things on the head. And honestly, one of the reasons, and I mean, I was for Bernie in 2016, and I just started to get really research into the energy issue. And a lot of that helped me kind of be like, wait a second, you know, what has the government really done to solve the climate issue when I know what the answer is, and the technologists could get back to work immediately to fix it if people just got out of the way. And that's honestly, that's kind of got me to kind of go over to like the liberty movement, whatever that
Right.
means. And I'm not. I try to be a moderate. I mean, there's some things I disagree with libertarians and the Libertarian Party, but as far as I'm concerned, I like most of what they have to say. But I mean, again, it's nuclear power is not necessarily a libertarian issue, but it makes sense that it's kind of been, supported because it's just it's it's just a good source of power that's affordable. So
it is what we believe in. It is a perfect encapsulation of what we believe in. We believe that the market and technology will bring us out, and what we call human action, just the idea that humans voluntarily interacting with one another in the market will always find better solutions to the problems that we face than any kind of centrally planned, politically considered organization like the government ever could, because just by the very nature of the structure of government compared to the structure of the market, we believe in what we call the spontaneous nature of the market, the so-called invisible hand, the idea that people working voluntarily and using price signals and supply and demand and research and collaboration and competition will come up with the most spontaneous and flexible options in real time to the problems that we face. And in contrast, the very brittle nature of a centrally planned organization that exists not based on demand or supply or price signals, but based instead on the fiat of law, based instead on the fact that someone once wrote on a sheet of paper that it has to be done this way, and therefore they will use whatever level of violence is necessary to force everyone to do what it says on that sheet of paper, whether or not it even makes sense to the people who are currently writing things on sheets of paper or the person whose job it is to force you to do that thing. You're never going to get the same kind of quality of outcome from that kind of an arrangement or that kind of an organization as you are from people just voluntarily working with one another.
yeah, and I think people would definitely like the more people learn about nuclear, the more they understand that's actually really cool, and the
Yep.
more people I think would want to buy it. they would want to be like, oh, if maybe I will pay a little bit of extra to a nuclear power company instead of a fossil fuel company, then unfortunately, energy use doesn't really work that way. But
Right.
but I mean, people would be like, hey, saving the planet and allowing to enjoy the you know material conditions of modern society. That's a people will pay for that, and I
Right,
think you're right. I
exactly.
mean, and plus, like for example, like me and my roommate, we've been really getting into eating meatless, and there's so many different alternatives now to to eat a low emission diet, and it's the freedom of choice. I just think is a good. It's always a good thing, and uh, but a little bit more on the libertarian idea of nuclear power. One like caveat to that is in the past, you've seen these large nuclear power projects being state sponsored. France,
Mhm.
you know, they did the right decision, but still the government mandated it. And I mean,
Right.
and there's something to be said that they just did it right. But then again, I don't want it I don't want to have to be like, okay, we aren't going to do your stuff. We're going to do that stuff. I mean, I want it to still be a choice. So so given that it usually big government has, you know, sponsored nuclear power, what do you believe is a way to make it more market friendly, if you will?
Absolutely. And in fact, here's a perfect example of why we don't want government to be involved even in the things we agree with. We see here and in Russia and in France and other places where, because the government was involved in nuclear energy, they often did everything they could to bury any kind of revelations about something unsafe that was happening on a nuclear plant or with the nuclear research, because they didn't want it to blow back on them for political considerations. And of course, that never works. People always find out what's happening. Chernobyl eventually melted down, and entire sections of the Ukraine are still unlivable as a result of that. If that had been a market influence thing, there would have been nothing in place for that company to simply ignore what was happening and try to hide it from everyone. As soon as there was some kind of risk of something happening, because of the fact that it would be a voluntary organization that did this, they wouldn't have the power of the state and the power of law to suppress information. Same thing with 3 Mile Island, probably the same thing with Fukushima. And I think that just allowing the market to do whatever the thing is, and in this case we're talking about nuclear energy, that also prevents on the other side, because there are risks with nuclear energy just like with any other source of energy, by removing the state, by removing that fiat of law, and by removing that ability to suppress information and to obfuscate and hide information. That makes it inherently safer. That brings in the people who are watchdogging and whistleblowing and making sure that if something unsafe is happening at a plant, people know very early so that it can be addressed before it becomes a real problem, as opposed to people for political considerations burying it and hoping that it doesn't blow up in their face until they're out of office and the next group of politicians has to deal with it. In terms of how to make nuclear energy more market friendly, again, I think if you remove the subsidies and the regulatory burdens and everything that make nuclear more expensive, and make its competitors artificially less expensive, like the subsidies for both renewables and green and fossil fuels, like the wars to increase access to fossil fuels. If you remove all of those things and simply allow the market to determine it, nuclear is going to be much better. Here's another perfect example, and you can give me your thoughts on this. The fact that we use uranium, from what I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've read, the reason that we are using uranium as our main source of nuclear energy instead of thorium is because you can't make nuclear weapons with thorium. And so when the initial push for nuclear energy was first happening in the 40s and 50s, the governments funded the uranium reactors because they were used as so-called breeder reactors to create plutonium to make nuclear energy. And so even though thorium is much more naturally available than uranium, I think it's several orders of magnitude more available. It is much more already naturally enriched, so it doesn't require any kind of enriching. It's much safer to use because it isn't fissile, and the chain reaction can basically be stopped at will. It has a half-life of a few hundred years instead of tens of thousands of years for uranium, and the starting amount of radiation is a fraction of a percent that of uranium. And but again, we're not using it as, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, we're not using it because it couldn't be used to make bombs. Now, here's a perfect example. If the government hadn't been the one directing our energy future, and if instead the market had been doing it, we probably would have used thorium instead of uranium because the market didn't need bombs that could take entire chunks out of the planet. That was something government needed for entirely political purposes. So uranium, from what I've read, and again, you can tell me if I'm on the right track here, uranium being used instead of thorium, and the inertia that we now have behind the fact that, government has invested, countless billions of dollars in uranium, and the market is built around that government investment, is a perfect example of investment decisions being made by the government instead of the market. Now, maybe I'm missing out on something here. Is my assessment of thorium versus uranium correct? Or
it's hitting certain things, but there's a lot of misconceptions about thorium, and there were quite a bit there. But I am not gonna it's not, it's just a matter of people like just watching some documentaries and learning a little bit about like the different reactors and fuel cycles.
Okay.
But thorium, it's just another basically fuel source, and actually the thorium is turned into uranium 233, which is actually
33, right.
fissile. So you can make a bomb out of that. But the thing is, with some futuristic like molten liquid reactors, is once that uranium is made, it's used immediately. But the thing is, you can use depleted uranium. You can breed it to be plutonium to be fuel again. You
Right.
can use you can use uranium 235. You can use thorium, which turns into uranium 233. There's all sorts of fuel cycles. So you got a few things wrong, but that's okay. Thorium, I like it because it allows people to be like, oh, it's like a cooler version of nuclear.
Right,
If that gets people interested, I'm all about it. But yeah, when you look at history, it's hard to say. But I think we needed to develop the weapon to end the war, but as a result of that, we used the fuel that was readily available, and we decided, let's just use uranium 235 because we're already making it for weapons.
We're already trying to make plutonium for weapons, right?
Exactly. And ironically, nuclear power is the biggest way to disarm nuclear weapons around the world. For about, I think, 15 years in the United States, half of our nuclear power plant fuel was made with a fuel from ex-Soviet warheads.
Oh, wow. So you can actually disarm the warheads and use the fuel rods for nuclear power production.
Yeah, it's basically turning like napalm back into regular old gasoline. Just a slow burn instead of what used to be made to destroy our cities now lights them. And I think that's actually a quite beauuful.
Yeah, that's turning swords into plowshares, right? Like that's a perfect example of that. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. And but not my idea, but a way around kind of the big infrastructure projects that the government have sponsored before is actually to kind of miniaturize the nuclear power systems to make them basically mass producible. And so you may want to ask like listeners and people I talk to look at some of the modular nuclear power designs, because there's a lot of them, and we can basically crank them out like ships or 747s if we wanted to, instead of building these big projects that require basically well-trained craftsmen to build the thing on site. When if we use more modular designs, we can build very standardized buildings and then just bring the reactors in and the fuel in and just swap them out. And that's kind of the future, I think, of nuclear. And again, if the market was actually fair, I think that's where most of the bids would go. So that's kind of like why I asked the question about, is it big government? Well, it doesn't have to. You can use the startups and these companies to to design things that are just more cost effective, and that's why modular designs are better than the big, honking plants we have now.
And with the modular designs, you could keep using the same land or the same area for
Yes.
those modular plants, so you wouldn't have several hundred or several thousand acres that used to be a power plant that's now having to sit there for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. Well, nuclear power plants can be dismantled, and they don't. I mean, they don't need to be worried about for tens of thousands of years. But
Okay.
but exactly right. Like with the newer stuff, the idea is that basically you would send in a reactor that's already fueled. You would run it, and then you would turn it off, let it sit for maybe 10 years, and then literally send it back to the company to be refurbished. So
Oh wow. Okay.
it's interesting. Like there's so many ways to do nuclear power, and it's not just the old Homer Simpson way. So uh, but yeah, I just think that's why I asked that question. So let me switch gears a little bit.
Mhm.
So I am really thrilled that a vice presidential nominee literally gets the science right on the head about nuclear and climate, and how science is really not political. It's just is. And the fact that politics kind of, makes people partisans on matters of science, actually frustrates me, because I
It
think
is, yeah.
it holds humanity back. And, but so I just want to say thank you for that. But given that you do believe climate change is a problem, and I do too, that we need to figure out, but I'm not just worried about it because it'll make things hotter. It'll flood the coastlines eventually. We don't know how soon it will,
Mhm.
and it could affect the animals and the natural world, cause some extinctions. I don't want any of that. But I'm more concerned about what climate change will do to the international economy. And I think that if we aren't careful, runaway climate change could severely damage the economy and the wealth we've accrued all these years. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at how much damage has been done economically because of COVID-19, which is
Mhm.
a virus, a highly, virulent pathogen that has a fatality rate of anywhere from as high as 5 or 6%, to as low as 0.2 or 0.3%. I mean, there are many factors involved there that determine how high or how low it is. And, we're unfortunately working with incomplete data. But the point is, that was a virus. We'll eventually either have herd immunity or have a vaccine, or they'll find an effective treatment that will be able to bring things back to at least somewhat relative to normal. It didn't destroy coastlines. It didn't render entire parts of the planet unlivable. It didn't change our weather. It was simply a virus that was more deadly than the flu and spread more easily than the flu. Imagine something that recedes our coastlines, makes entire islands disappear, makes entire parts of the world unlivable, completely changes how our weather is, changes what parts of the planet we can even live on. There are so many things that could happen. Changes our ecosystem because of, like you said, affecting affecting everything from the coral reefs to animals and everything in between. Imagine all the damage that can be done by that. I mean, not just economically, but just the entire fabric of our society, socially, economically, interactions between different governments, increasing competition for resources. There's so many ways that it could affect things. And if there is a way for us to be able to solve or ameliorate that, or at least slow down that process, while also increasing access to energy and reducing the costs, it seems like a no-brainer to me. And if there are any kind of safety challenges there, well, then those are safety challenges for us to look into and face. Those aren't reasons not to do it. Now, I actually have a couple questions for you. And this is because I also have my podcast, so I always go into questioning mode. But there are two things
Please.
I heard of, and you can tell me how how legit these are, but a couple things I heard of that supposedly might be able to really dramatically change. And I'm sure you've heard of these things 1,000 times, and these are probably like silly questions to you since you do this all day long. But two things I heard of that could potentially drastically and dramatically change the safety profile of nuclear energy. One was using chirped pulse amplification lasers on spent fuel rods, which would be able to potentially reduce the half-life from from the tens of thousands or thousands of years that they currently are to a matter of minutes. The person who came up with the idea said that he believes it would reduce the half-life of a spent nuclear fuel rod down to as little as 30 minutes. And then the other one was the idea of encapsulating the spent graphite, the fuel graphite, or the radioactive graphite inside of diamonds that would act as batteries that could last for as much as 5,000 years. Could be used in all sorts of applications like space travel or even pacemakers, pretty much anything where you wouldn't want to have to change the battery or have an actual source of energy. But it would also keep us safe from the radioactivity that's in that fuel for the thousands of years that it's encapsulated. Are those things legit at all, or just kind of hype, or what do you think of those?
So the laser thing, I don't know hardly anything about that, but I actually had a physics professor at my school that was talking about something about lasers and how you can use special lasers to, I think, to transmute the elements
Yes.
from the more like slowly decaying ones to ones that decay quickly. So you
Right.
just you get it down to background levels very quickly. I don't know if that's really that necessary because we can use we can recycle the fuel till it's gone forever. So the idea of like spent fuel being, basically a toxic pain in the ass forever, it's not true. It's literally mostly unspent fuel because basically the fission reaction causes it to wear out the fuel rods, so they just don't work anymore. They crack and get brittle, and they don't undergo the fission reaction properly. But with newer reactors that use like molten liquids, literally a big vat of molten salt with the fuel is mixed in with the salt, and you keep adding the fuel to it over time. It burns through all of it. I'm not sure exactly. I may be getting some of this wrong, but the physics is there to recycle all the fuel, and there we can put it underground. We can use deep borehole storage if we really want to get away from it. But the thing is, there's just not that much nuclear waste. So I you know that sounds great. To if we had some like kind of icky radioactive stuff that we just wanted to, get down to background radiation quickly, that'd be, I mean, that'd be optimal. So that way we don't have to worry about it. So about the graphite, I'm not sure. Graphite. I don't think is used. It's called, I believe it's called like they either use it as a moderator or a control substance that either slows down neutrons or stops them altogether. Uh, the I'm not sure if graphite's really used in reactors anymore. I think there are some molten salt ones that can use graphite, but I'm not sure on like the nitty gritty of like the all the technology.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but the diamonds thing, the thing is, so the most of our spacecraft that leave Earth into deep space past Mars all use nuclear power, and a lot of people don't
Right.
realize
Right.
that. But they use an isotope of plutonium, which is, I think, either plutonium 240 or plutonium 238, and it's really hot. It stays hot, like thermally hot. So it uses like a temperature differential in space to produce a current that can run your thrusters. So, but those kind of decay away after like 30 years to where they don't really produce much electricity. Using powering stuff on decay, I don't think is very, from what I've heard, it's not very efficient because
Okay.
decay is pretty slow. You're best off busting up those atoms instead of just letting them, spit off particle here and there, So, but yeah, there's again, like I said, there's a million ways to do nuclear power, and who knows what we could unlock eventually. Eventually we could reach fusion, but until then, we have plenty of fission material and stuff like that. And so those are good questions, and it's sad the maybe some of the environmental activists that want to just totally dismiss nuclear. You are essentially blinding yourself to a miraculous and completely uh, valid part of science. And it's like saying, "Oh, we won't talk about that science and technology." No, it's here to stay, and the things we can do with it are just quite remarkable uh, to advance, you know, civilization. I mean, if we get our energy stuff figured out, we can recycle stuff until so we can use closed looped capitalism where all materials are just, processed back to their basic molecules and then recycled again. We can
Right.
desalinate the water from the oceans. Uh, we can start pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into like basically petroleum fuels. So essentially, uh, zero net emission gasoline that is made by pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and water, which needs to be done anyway because the oceans are becoming acidic, and so there are this technology allows us to just do so many things that wind and solar simply can't. Wind and solar basically necessitates we do less when if anything we need to do a lot more as a planet in terms of energy. And honestly, it is an ethical issue because developing countries deserve the same access to energy that the average American does.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and anyone who says otherwise, I don't want to say fascist, but it kind of is. It's like saying, oh well, we've got ours, you don't have yours, so you're basically screwed,
It's let them eat cake as an energy policy, and that unfortunately
Exactly.
often happens with the so-called woke crowd in the Western world, because our only standard, our only frame of reference is how we live. When you try to explain that some of the ideas, and not just energy, but economic ideas, labor ideas, things like that, if applied to the developing world, will lead to massive famine and massive destitution. And in this case, a total lack of access to energy, and forcing them to, I mean, I remember reading about how I forget what the policy was, but it basically stopped the production of nuclear energy in parts of sub-Saharan Africa,
Hmm.
in parts where their main source of energy was burning trees and animal dung, and they
Yep.
were actually getting diseases from the aerosolization of what was in the animal dung.
Yep.
We don't even process that because we're so
Yep.
far removed from living that way that it really is. It's like, well, let them eat cake. Oh, they can't
We
have
yep.
nuclear. Well,
We
then I
yeah.
guess they'll have to use their solar panels instead. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. And we're using nuclear, and we're also using coal and a lot of other dirty stuff that we really don't like to think about.
Right.
So no, it's a perfect example of that. And I think part of what's feeding it is also because we're so far removed, we're often fed our ideas from major media and from pop culture. And within pop
Mhm.
culture, it's almost universal that nuclear is seen as this, obviously terrible thing that, should never be uh, thought of as a great way for energy. But who is it that provides our entertainment? Who is it that provides our news sources? You have a handful of large oligarchical corporations
Mhm.
that are, cronies to the government, but also they're also in some cases they're owned by, or they own themselves, fossil fuel companies and
Yeah.
energy companies related to fossil fuel. And so when we see that the more nuclear is replaced with the so-called renewables like wind and solar and so forth, you end up with, like we were saying before, a situation where more fossil fuels have to get burned during those times when the wind and solar aren't producing enough to cut it. Whereas with nuclear, it's just sort of this steady flow of energy from start to finish for however many decades that it's online. It's perfect for the fossil fuel people. They get to pretend that they're trying to help the environment by implementing these renewable sources of energy, but then they also get to burn more fossil fuels. And so it's like a
Yep.
win-win for them. They get so-called environmentalist street cred, but then they also get to burn more fossil fuels and produce more greenhouse gases. And I was surprised to find that there were a number of people who thought that nuclear energy produced greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
And because again, they didn't know, and they're just seeing these they're seeing these reactors that are, with the steam coming out of them and assuming that that's a greenhouse gas. And it's like, no, that's just water vapor, and it's actually harmless, and it doesn't hurt anything, and it certainly isn't, changing our climate's temperature. So no, it's a lot of misinformation, and it's a lot of the kind of standard issue, elitism that the average person in the Western developed world has.
Yeah, and it's I'm so glad you know about this stuff because uh, a lot of people just I can't even fault them. They don't know enough
They
about
don't
the
know.
energy
Yeah.
system, and I think that's why when I first started this, realizing that nuclear is the way forward, and it actually helped me find a purpose in life because I thought I was going to be like a lab scientist, but I realized my disability would have made that really difficult to pursue the education needed for that. And I found this, but I've immersed myself with a bunch of very, passionate, scientifically literate, humanist people that understand that we're doing this to lift up humanity, and it's easy to, you know, demonize electricity and energy, but in my opinion, I think energy is equivalent to freedom. So that's just my opinion. You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
so
Yeah, I mean the more access to energy we have, the easier our lives can be, the less we are having to physically toil, and therefore the freer we are to pursue other things. And the cheaper it is, the freer we are financially to pursue those other things. So, I mean, it's not for nothing that the market is often trying to deal with our energy problem as the first and foremost issue. Because if you don't have something to power whatever your idea is, it's not going very far.
yeah, and my follow up to that question would be like, is climate change a threat to liberty around the world? We kind of pretty much went over that, but I like have an example. I'd like people to listen to. It's um, South Africa. uh, Cape Town had a water crisis where they were tracking to realize an exact point when the city would run out of water full stop. And they were able to ration their way out of it. And eventually the rains came again. But, there is technology like we can use like some modular nuclear power plants to power reverse osmosis desalination factories that could provide like one nuclear power plant about I think it was like 1 gigawatt, so like a big ass coal plant, uh, or a really big natural gas plant could provide the entire city with water forever. So when it comes to like basically disarming some potential conflicts, nuclear does that because it can literally full sail limit the amount of climate change, and it could produce abundance from scarcity, which is you know, what leads to a lot of international conflicts. So,
Most conflict boils down to resources. Whatever
mhm.
precept there was that caused it, whether those people are bad people and we're the good people, almost always, if you look at what the actual fight was over, what the pretext was behind it, the actual reason for it was either land and land is just another resource, some form of resources. It always boiled down to that. I mean, the original conflicts before there were even governments were people fighting over food and land. And it's the same thing now. The most fighting is happening because of a power grab for resources. So anything that increases the amount of resources inherently correspondingly reduces the amount of conflict, because the more plentiful, if we live in a land of milk and honey where everything we could possibly want or need simply is falling from the sky, there'd be no need for any kind of conflict. Now obviously we don't live in a utopia like that, but we can use technology for an example, for using this example, nuclear energy, to increase our resources, not just the energy, but when energy is that much more available and cheap, like you said, so many other things can happen. Water desalination, pulling carbon from the sky and from the waters, all of these things that can only happen when you have massive amounts of cheap energy. And yes, anything that increases resources and reduces the cost of those resources is going to inherently not just increase or reduce conflict, but it's also, as a result of reducing conflict, is going to increase our liberty, because our liberty is dependent on having as few people as possible trying to aggress against our liberty, and having us in as good of a position as possible to defend our liberty. And if you reduce the amount of aggression and the amount of conflict, then liberty is going to flourish. The more we are able, we are in a position to casually and agreeably interact with each other in a voluntary way, without this frantic run for trying to get enough to be able to, enough resources to be able to survive. Of course we're going to live freer lives, because there are fewer people trying to fight each other just for basic resources that we need. So absolutely, that feeds to less conflict and more liberty.
Definitely. Well, I kind of have one more question here,
Sure.
and then we can talk about whatever you want till your time's up, or to not tell your time's up till you have to go do the politics thing. So
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of came up with this question at random. So
Sure.
a big problem, especially with things like housing in the United States, is no one lets people build where the building needs to happen.
Yes.
And so what I'm worried about is, even if the federal government backed off of nuclear power and streamlined it with, and I'm going to say nuclear might need some federal oversight because it's nuclear material, but that's just my opinion. But I mean, we can fight about that another day, but not fight about it, but talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm just worried people are going to like weaponize local laws and regulations to make sure nuclear is never even built, and they'll still keep claiming these, just wrong, false safety things of like, oh, we can't have that in the middle of a city, even though newer plants could never melt down by the very laws of physics. So you can build them closer to cities without being scared about them. How do you think we could deal with the kind of NIMBYs, not in my backyard,
Yep.
folks that want to use the force of local government to prevent, what's needed to be built?
Yeah, we have many terms that are used for this. The NIMBYs, the not in my backyards. Popular term that I guess started last year and has become real popular this year is the Karens. The
Right.
people that are constantly in a vigilant look for anyone who's violating even the smallest bylaws, so they can report it to others. We've got the I call them the petty tyrants, right? So we had a situation in my neighborhood where one of my neighbors wanted to be able to do some physical therapy in her home, and she's licensed to do so. And there wasn't going to be any kind of prescriptions given. There wasn't going to be any kind of blood taking or anything that involved injecting anyone. No penetration of the skin. It was literally going to be stretching and help, education on how to do different exercises and some massage. And there were some in the neighborhood who banded together to fight that, because they said we don't want businesses here, and we don't want people coming. They came up with the most absurd excuses. What if one of the customers is a pedophile and they come around our children here? I mean, they lost their minds because this lady simply wanted to be able to do some stretching, and again, this is a licensed physical therapist, to do stretching and massage and exercise in her home. And they lost their minds. So NIMBYism is always a problem to have to face. And this is actually what we call, in libertarian circles and in the Libertarian Party, we call it the cult of the omnipotent state. And there are many parts to what that cult is. But one of the parts is the idea that what someone else does on their own property that in no way harms or even directly infringes upon you in any real way is somehow your business just because it's near you. And that takes a culture change. And that's a big part of what we as libertarians are challenging, is the idea that, and I mean, we've seen it with everything from methadone clinics to
Affordable housing.
Affordable housing is a huge one. So perfect example, Phil, like you said, we have artificial supply restrictions on housing because of zoning laws that are based on people saying, wow, I kind of like my neighborhood looking like this. I think everywhere within however many square miles of me should look like this too. And I don't care what the people who own those properties would rather do with them. And I certainly don't want them to build lots of housing because that infringes upon my liking how my neighborhood looks. And so as a result, housing becomes artificially scarce and artificially more
Mm-hmm.
expensive, which is a direct, in many ways, because they are utilizing the state to do this, it is a form of aggression against the poor. It is a form of imposition of their personal aesthetic on people who can't afford housing and end up being homeless. And then those homeless people are treated as a blight when in fact, they are the victims of petty tyranny. So perfect example of this with nuclear weapons is or nuclear energy, I'm sorry, with nuclear energy, perfect example. Not only do we need to be fighting against the bad misinformation against nuclear energy, but we need to be fighting against the bad misinformation about the idea that we should be petty tyrants and that we should be imposing our personal preferences and aesthetics on the properties of others. And it is, it's not just at the federal level, it's all the way down to the bottom.
Right.
Like you said, it is a local issue. With that said, I do think that there is, as these technologies come out and as they proliferate, I think that people will
Mm-hmm.
naturally see that it's not as much of a risk as they thought that it was going to be. Now, will there be some resistance? Yes,
Yeah.
but that's where education and counter activism against their NIMBYism will come into place. So the short answer is vigilance. We just have to be vigilant, and we have to fight bad misinformation with good, factual, scientifically sourced and scientifically backed information, and we need to, in a greater sense, fight against the prevailing idea that we should be able to impose our preferences on others and their properties.
Yeah, that was supposed to segue to my last bit is can we convince the public to take a second look at the nuclear? And I'm going to emphatically, is that the right word? Emphatically say yes, because I like our organization is proof of that. The pro nuclear movement on the internet has exploded,
Yep.
and people have come to information that's better. And a lot of people realize they've been lied to about this source of power, and that it it was the future all along. And I think, especially the younger generation that didn't deal with the Cold War and like Chernobyl and stuff, uh, are going to be totally fine with it and be like, that's actually really cool. The fear of nuclear, I think a lot of it just had to do with the Cold War. And now I think people are realizing that, hey, you need to look at everything. And in fact, something interesting is I went to a Bernie Sanders rally with a sign that said Bernie is wrong about nuclear power because he wants to phase it all out, which would be catastrophic for our emissions. Thank God. I mean, I'm I'm not disappointed he wasn't the nominee. Like, but sorry, Bernie people, but I mean, you know, I don't want to make enemies here. But uh, and pretty much all the young people agreed with me, and I was like, I think we're going in the right direction. And the fact that we have a presidential nominee, I mean, I hope they can get in the debates. We'll see. That can mention nuclear power is just so needed right now. It's and if we have like people talking about the real solutions, people will people are looking for a leader, and they'll if some high ranking officials start to talk about it, I think people will start to talk about it more and open their minds and try to learn uh, the best information they can.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So, well, hey, we've been talking for a long time. We've touched on a lot of stuff. Uh, I am so glad you know so much about this, and I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Thank
Uh,
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Definitely, and you and you and Joe seems like a good team. Would you? Is there any place people can look to learn more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone wants to find out more, first of all, you can follow me on my social media on Twitter at Real Spike Cohen, or on Facebook, Spike Cohen, Your Next VP, or in the Facebook, or I guess in the address bar, it's facebook.com/literally Spike Cohen. And obviously, you can find out about Joe Jorgensen, my presidential running mate, anywhere on social media. If you type in Joe Jorgensen, Jorgensen, you will find her on all the various social media platforms. Our website is Joj 2020. That's Joj2020.com. You can donate. You can sign up to volunteer. You can join our team. We would love to have you. Joe Jorgensen and I seek nothing less than a world set free. Imagine a situation in which you are saving thousands of dollars because you are no longer being coercively taxed to fund a bunch of things that do nothing to help your life and are only being used for war and endless caging of innocent people and endless printing of fiat notes to fund political considerations that have nothing to do with your life. Imagine if the wars end and our troops come home and the healing begins and the blowback from people who are sick of being invaded by us ends and the terrorism ends. Imagine if the PTSD and the traumatic brain injury and the rash of veteran suicides goes down and eventually ends because we're no longer sending our loved ones overseas to fight in wars that have nothing to do with our safety and everything to do with the protection of crony interests. Imagine if the war on drugs and the war on sex work ends and the prisons open and the people who committed victimless crimes, things that should have never been crimes to begin with, are able to go home and are able to build themselves back up and are able to get good jobs and be reunited with their families. Imagine a situation in which people are not having to choose between destitution and poverty and a life of crime because occupational licensing has been removed and the poor are able to work themselves up through peaceful entrepreneurialism and be able to build themselves out so that they don't have to live on welfare and they don't have to live a life of crime to get ahead in life. Imagine a world set free. Imagine a world where you are freer, safer, happier, and which your children have a better future. That is the world that Joe Jorgensen and I wish to create. And with your support, we can do it. And with your vote, we can do it. And we thank you for your time, and we hope to have your support this November.
Well said, sir. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you again sometime, maybe.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Yeah, thanks. There you have it. We have talked to Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen, Libertarian Party nominees for President and Vice President of the United States, about how nuclear power is a technologically valid, economically viable, and politically nonpartisan way to address the climate crisis. It's great to know that enabling nuclear deployment is a major climate strategy in a major political party. If you like what you heard and want more content, you can support us and our mission online at www.americansfornuclearenergy, all one word, .org. Again, that's www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase some A&E swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees to keep our organization running. We are a group of almost 10 volunteers at the moment, and we could use some monetary support. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you can email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy, all one word, .org. Again, that's main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. Thank you for tuning into this episode. This is Phil Ord of A&E's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.